Bartholomew Town is brought to you in part by the University of Rhode Island Online, Navigant Credit Union, the Audubon Society of Rhode Island, Newport Film, and Half Street Group.
Bartholomew Town.
Here we are. After all of that, it is the day before the election, and it'll be interesting to see when we actually have a result. It could be as soon as late Tuesday night, early Wednesday. It could be much further down the line. In any case, as we try to make sense of all this, sometimes it's good to look backwards to the history of the American presidency. And joining us this morning is Dr. Bill Leeman, who is with Salve Regina University, a history professor, and someone who is really a presidential scholar and is going to help us contextualize what's been happening here and what is likely going to happen over the next couple of days, not in terms of making an election prediction, but just in terms of procedurally. Doctor, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Your read right now, contextualizing this presidential election cycle with those of the past?
Well, certainly, pundits are constantly talking about the unprecedented nature of the election of 2024, certain things that have not happened in presidential elections previously, behavior from a candidate that has not happened in presidential elections previously. We had the sitting president decide that he wasn't going to run for re-election. We've had 2 assassination attempts on one of the candidates. And we have the first woman of color running for president. So certainly there are things that are very much unprecedented about the election. But if you look back through American history, there are some precedents to some of the things that have gone on in 2024. And one of the ones that I've been thinking a lot about over the past couple of weeks, there's been a lot of press coverage of former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney campaigning with Kamala Harris. And I think political commentators are having a lot of fun with this because no one ever would have predicted that previously. Even Congresswoman Cheney's father, former Vice President Dick Cheney, who is a very, very conservative Republican, announcing that he was also going to be endorsing and voting for Kamala Harris. But if you look back through American history, we do see a couple of prominent examples of political rivals, people who disagreed on policy in pretty much every conceivable way, ultimately allying together for what they see as the good of the country. So a couple of examples that I've been thinking about, first and probably most notably, and I say most notably in part because it relates to the very popular Broadway musical Hamilton, but a case from the presidential election of 1800. So the election of 1800 was pitting John Adams against Thomas Jefferson. John Adams running for re-election. Jefferson was, of course, Adams's vice president, the sitting vice president at the time. But what makes the election of 1800 more interesting is that through an anomaly under the Constitution, in the Electoral College, Jefferson and his vice presidential running mate, Aaron Burr, both ended up getting the same number of electoral votes. They both had 73 electoral votes. According to the Constitution, when that happens, the election's thrown to the United States House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives decides who is elected president. When that happened, Alexander Hamilton ended up throwing his support behind Thomas Jefferson. And what's interesting about this is Hamilton and Jefferson were longtime political rivals, going back to their time in George Washington's cabinet, Hamilton serving as Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Jefferson serving as Washington's Secretary of State. And the two of them had this rivalry that was very much based on 2 completely different interpretations of the Constitution. Hamilton taking a more loose interpretation of the Constitution, basically claiming that if the Constitution did not specifically prohibit something, then the government could take that particular action. Jefferson taking a much more strict view of the Constitution and claiming that unless the Constitution specifically authorized the government to take an action, then it did not have that power. And the two of them butted heads over a variety of issues, whether it was foreign policy, whether it was Hamilton's financial plan, and it did create a certain amount of animosity between the two of them. But when Hamilton looked at the situation in 1800 and looks at Jefferson, looks at Burr, Hamilton decided that for the good of the country, he needed to back Jefferson. And in his mind, yes, he disagreed with Jefferson in pretty much every policy area you could think of, but he did at the very least respect Jefferson as someone who he felt would do what he thought was in the best interest of the country. Hamilton might disagree with Jefferson's views on what was in the best interest of the country, but he knew that Jefferson would pursue what Jefferson saw as the public good and not pursue his own private gain, and would govern with integrity. And Hamilton could not say that about Aaron Burr. The two of them, both coming out of kind of rough and tumble New York politics, they had also a longstanding and in many cases far more bitter rivalry in New York. And Hamilton viewed Burr as somebody who was corrupt, someone who could not be trusted with power, someone who would be dangerous in the presidency. And so we have kind of a similar situation here where you have the Cheneys, and particularly former Congresswoman Cheney, even though she disagrees probably on just about every policy issue with Vice President Harris, she sees Vice President Harris as somebody who will put the good of the country before her own private gain. And she also sees former President Trump as somebody who is dangerous to the country and someone who cannot be trusted with power. So I'd say that's kind of the first most prominent example. There's an entire song about it in the musical Hamilton, but kind of a similar situation that doesn't get as much attention goes back to the longtime political rivalry between Abraham Lincoln and Senator Stephen Douglas. So their rivalry goes back to Illinois, back to their days in the state legislature. And certainly they're running against each other in 1860 for the presidency. They had run against each other for Douglas's Senate seat in 1858. Douglas ultimately retaining his seat. It was during that Senate campaign where you have the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates that we often hear about. So Douglas and Lincoln, longtime political rivalry, but Lincoln ultimately, of course, is elected president. Shortly after he becomes president, shortly after he takes office, we have the Confederate firing on Fort Sumter. And Senator Stephen Douglas very prominently announces his support for Abraham Lincoln and essentially says something along the lines of, we can either have patriots or traitors in this country. And he encourages his fellow Democrats to back Abraham Lincoln. And then Stephen Douglas sadly passes away shortly after that. But I think that's another prominent example of people who disagreed on a wide variety of policy issues and had this long-standing political rivalry, but ultimately put the good of the country ahead of partisan politics. So I think that example of Lincoln and Douglas is also an important one to mention.
Certainly. And it's going to be interesting when we look back, when historians look back on this election, regardless of the outcome, when that contextualization takes place, where what is the good of the country? Because there seems to be one of the through lines in American politics, society right now, is what represents the good of the country, what represents the Constitution, what represents what supposedly America actually is. So disagreements there are going to be interesting to monitor as we move forward in terms of what the general public wants. You could make the same argument, I suppose, about the Civil War and many other times throughout American history. Fast forwarding from your most recent example, Lyndon Johnson and his retirement, so to speak. Mm-hmm. What, if any, parallels do you see with Joe Biden in terms of both the moment and the consequences of a sitting president essentially retiring, for lack of a better term, but also in terms of how he's going to be perceived? Impossible to predict the future, but at the time, Lyndon Johnson, what was the perception of then President Johnson as he announced his decision to not seek re-election?
Yeah, so I think that's a great example. The 1968 election, I think for a couple of reasons, provides some really important insight into what we're seeing in 2024. So Lyndon Johnson, at the start of 1968, he is certainly planning on running for re-election to the presidency. But what ends up happening at the end of January, there's something going on in Vietnam known as the Tet Offensive. It was this large-scale military operation that was essentially North Vietnamese forces, the Viet Cong, attacking multiple sites in South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. And all of this is being captured on television. Vietnam, in many ways, was kind of the first living room war. So the American people were able to watch what was going on. And this was a serious problem for Lyndon Johnson. Maybe not necessarily in a military sense, because U.S. and South Vietnamese forces did push back against the Tet Offensive. Johnson and the Pentagon are trying to depict it as a U.S. victory, but it's not interpreted that way. And the reason it's not interpreted that way by the public or the press is because Johnson had been, for years at this point, giving very rosy, overly optimistic, not necessarily accurate descriptions of what was going on in Vietnam, saying things like there's light at the end of the tunnel, victory is coming. And what the Tet Offensive demonstrated to people was that Johnson had not really been honest with the American people about what was going on in Vietnam. And you even had, coming out of that, Walter Cronkite, who Gallup polls showed at the time was the most trusted man in America. Walter Cronkite says at the end of his news broadcast, he basically calls out the U.S. government, calls out Lyndon Johnson, and essentially tells the American people that the United States is mired in stalemate in Vietnam, and that the government's been misrepresenting what's been going on there. So that is a huge hit to Lyndon Johnson's approval. Added to that, he is able to win the first Democratic primary in 1968, the New Hampshire primary, but he only polls about 7 percentage points ahead of a relatively unknown anti-war senator, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota. And even though Johnson does end up winning, the fact that it was by such a small margin against somebody who was relatively unknown, who's running against the sitting president of the United States, it's interpreted as a defeat for Johnson. And as a result of that, Senator Robert F. Kennedy sees Johnson as vulnerable, and Kennedy decides to jump into the election at that point. And then, of course, at the end of March, we have that famous televised address from Lyndon Johnson, in which he announces that he is going to pursue some kind of peace settlement with North Vietnam, but also shocks the world by announcing he will not seek another term as president. And so that creates a very similar situation to what we have this year with President Biden announcing that he also would not seek re-election. President Biden, for different circumstances, obviously, than Johnson, but President Biden, somebody who was struggling with his approval ratings, someone who has been seen as a very unpopular incumbent president at this point. And we also see parallels to the situation that the two men's respective vice presidents have to deal with. So in Johnson's case, it's Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who, after the assassination of Bobby Kennedy in June of 1968, Humphrey becomes the frontrunner. He will be the Democratic nominee. Humphrey is in a very difficult position because he is vice president for an unpopular president. And Humphrey, in many ways, because of personal loyalty to Johnson, is never able to bring himself to completely repudiate Johnson, particularly about Vietnam, the conduct of the war in Vietnam. And Humphrey, of course, ultimately goes on to be defeated in a relatively close election, not close by today's standards, but by 1960s standards. Humphrey goes on to be defeated by Richard Nixon in 1968. And some historians believe that a big part of that was Humphrey not repudiating Johnson. And we have Vice President Kamala Harris in a very similar situation where she's running as the sitting vice president for a relatively unpopular president. And so she is trying to navigate the situation of remaining loyal to an administration that she's part of, and an individual that advanced her political career and endorsed her when he stepped down, or announced that he wasn't going to be running for re-election, but also trying to convince the American people that she represents something new. And so I think in that instance, 1968 is a very important election for providing some kind of historical insight into what we're seeing today. And I would even argue, I often get the question, whether it's from students or other people, if former President Trump reminds me of any other candidates that have run for president. And the one that often comes to my mind, or almost always comes to mind, is the third party candidate in 1968, Alabama Governor George Wallace, who you can see many similarities between him and former President Trump, whether it's his populist appeal, trying to appeal to kind of disenchanted, angry white voters, or Wallace frequently talked about how any kind of foreign aid was a waste of money, which kind of sounds similar to some of the things former President Trump has said, particularly about aid to Ukraine. George Wallace talked about making allies in Europe and our allies in Asia pay more for their own defense, which is something we've heard former President Trump talk about, both when he was president and certainly on the campaign trail. But also Wallace was very much someone who stoked fear, someone who kind of sought to create division or capitalize on divisions within American society, including divisions over race, somebody who's cultivating hate. And so that's another parallel for 1968 that I do see with 2024.
That's a really interesting and important point that you raised there that hasn't been raised all that often. And there's a tremendous through line right there, no matter how you look at it. Lastly here, just sort of, there's kind of two possibilities. There's actually a nearly unlimited mathematical possibilities for how things could go in this election, but two distinct scenarios that have been suggested. One is this notion that either there's going to be what has been called a blue tsunami, or then you see Elon Musk telling you that, Trump's going to win every state. So you look at 1984, other than Minnesota, Ronald Reagan, with an unbelievable performance that's almost shocking at this point, literally winning every state. But then we look at 2000, of course, the hanging chads, Bush v. Gore. And the sort of two extremes in our most recent contemporary version of presidential history, barring 2020 itself, and, that's almost in its own category. Without making a prediction right now, or unless you'd like to, your sense of where this election could fall when we look at scenarios like 84 and 2000. Are we that close, or is this leaning towards something a little bit more standard in terms of somebody's going to get the requisite electoral votes and we move on in life?
I would say not to make too much of a prediction. I do think someone is going to get the requisite number of electoral votes. I'm not saying that's going to happen tomorrow night. It could take a little longer. I think ultimately what it comes down to is which side gets their people out to vote most. And based on what commentators are saying right now, for instance, a lot of people are talking about this poll out of Iowa that just came out that has Vice President Harris up by 3 percentage points in what was considered a very deep red state. And a lot of people are believing that the reason that's happening is mobilizing the vote of women, the fact that Iowa also just had a 6-week abortion law put on the books, which is mobilizing. I would say if that trend, first of all, is accurate, that could be kind of an indication of where things could be heading, particularly in a state like Wisconsin, possibly in the rural parts of a state like Pennsylvania. If that happens, that's obviously very good for Vice President Harris. But I certainly do not think that 2024 is going to result in something anywhere close to 1984.
Right.
I think it will be much closer to 2000 or even 2020.
No doubt about it. And all eyes on, that Seltzer poll, and also just in general, what we might see in these coming days from exit polling. What does exit polling look like compared to early voting? At the end of the day, it's kind of like, I always say, it's kind of like sports talk. I mean, you can call up a radio station and tell them that you think that, whoever should bat fifth in July against the Yankees or whatever, but we just have to wait and see. And we will.
Yes, we do.
And those who see back as far as we can are historians, and oftentimes are the most important people to make sense of our world today and where we're going. Dr. Leeman, thanks so much for your time and great work at Salve.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks again for having me.
Half Street Group brings a new generation's perspective to leadership communications, strategic public relations, and digital marketing. Half Street helps organizations and leaders take control of their own stories and manage their reputations. They get results for their clients by focusing on audience, message, and culture, and by leveraging their decade-long relationship with media and opinion leaders in the Ocean State and throughout New England. Join me and Half Street Group founder and president Mike Rea for a conversation every month about news of the day, the hottest media analysis, and a look behind the scenes at how impactful leaders drive conversations. Learn more at halfstreetgroup.com. As Rhode Island's first ever member-owned credit union, Navigant Credit Union has been a staple in the local business community for more than 108 years. Today, Navigant is a $3.4 billion institution serving more than 136,000 members across 25 physical branch locations. But since its founding in 1915, the mission has never changed. Navigant Credit Union's team of financial professionals have remained committed to improving the financial well-being of the families, businesses, and communities they serve across Rhode Island. Learn more at navigantcu.org. Our news desert is getting bigger and drier. Poignant words from Wayne Cabot as he was signing off WCBS New York for the final time. The news radio icon going off the air. And hey, we try to do our part every day here at Bartholomew Town, ripodcast.com. And part of our sustainability depends on our listeners. And if you would like to support the independent journalism that we produce, visit patreon.com/BartholomewTown or just click the support link wherever you're listening. Hey, thanks for stopping by Bartholomew Town. For more content, follow me on Instagram at Bill Bartholomew.